Good evening and welcome to Have I Got News for You? I'm Isabella Ford. In the news this decade, things have happened. Here to discuss these things we have regular team captains Nellie McClung and Sojourner Truth. On Nellie's team we have Barbara Bodekin, and on Sojourner's team Miss Florence Nightingale. We'll start with some of the bigger stories this decade. Nellie and Barbara, here's your clip.
Yes, there's the Soviets celebrating their general dominance over surrounding countries. Frightening.
Frightening indeed. That's a telegraph machine.
Well spotted. And here's President Truman looking quite stately in the stateliness of the stately Oval Office.
Quite stately.
George Kennan, I believe.
Yes.
Right? Yes, the American ambassador to Russia. He thought the Soviets were getting just a little bit too powerful and too influential in neighboring countries.
He sent a long telegraph to President Truman at that time, telling him that the US should begin a policy of containment to stop the communist expansion.
Quite, and really a risky undertaking when you think about it. He's an
Quite.
American in Russia, and they could easily get him in trouble for that. But yes, they wanted, America wanted to protect the freedoms and the rights of, of other countries, just a proper stance to take, indubitably, on this policy. And they were breaking their previous stance of non-interference in Europe, which is the correct thing to do, but rather, revolutionary for America. Truman, though, wasn't able to do quite so much because he was a Democratic president with a completely Republican government. It's just, the silly American government has it.
Well, that's when he came up with a strategy. He used the domino theory, and the domino theory states that one communist event leads to another communist event, leading to revolution and eventually total world communism. And it obviously worked because US stepped out of their isolationism and agreed with him.
Yes, the American policy towards, especially the Soviets, morphed from a period of détente to a policy of quite strict containment. Silly Americans. Yes, the Truman Doctrine is what came out of this, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. It was the US policy stating that they would give both economical and military aid to Greece and Turkey to try to keep them out of communism control.
Yes, the American policy towards, especially the Soviets, morphed from a period of détente to a policy of quite strict containment. Silly Americans.
So, do you think it was effective?
Well, it involved lots of money, as everything American inevitably does, and it involved lots of propaganda, as they're also very fond of using, and it involved lots of governmental control, as everything American always does. And they were trying to keep the non-communist governments from falling to the Soviets, and they did this by sending advisors to run their government, and economic aid to run their government, and their all-time American favorite military force to run their governments. And it really wasn't that effective.
Well, I quite disagree.
What makes you say that?
Well, really, the whole idea of containment, it was necessary. I mean, it was a very good idea. They needed it. They needed to stop the expansion of communism. The whole world could have fell.
Oh yes, I agree completely, but what I'm saying is they could have prevented so much more if they had stepped in earlier. I mean, look at history. World War I, they were late. World War II, they were late. They could have changed so much, and I'm just saying they should have stepped in much earlier.
But they didn't know.
They don't read newspapers?
And Sojourner and Florence, here's your clip.
That looks like Europe in ruins. So this has to be the post-war effects on European countries.
And here's President Truman signing some documents.
That's George Marshall?
Oh, of course! This is what we've come to call the Marshall Plan. George Marshall, the Secretary of State, put forward this reconstruction plan to deal with war-devastated Europe.
Before the end of the war, Britain would have seen the situation in continental Europe, and they would have provided the funds and strength to support them from the threat of communism. But everyone in Europe at that point was completely ruined.
Including Britain.
Exactly. There was no way that they could have done anything.
So what happened basically was that the US steps in, gallantly of course, as is their nature, and brings in funds to support Europe in their time of need. Basically they wanted to rebuild Europe, modernize the industry so that they could get back up on their feet, and remove the trade barriers so that Europe would be united against communism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that insight. And now we'll move on to our final round, the odd one out round. Our teams will be given 4 different subjects, and as the title might suggest, they will be expected to discover which is the odd one out. Here are your subjects.
Ah yes, I believe I know. The French were involved in the League of Nations, and that failed. The French were also very much involved in the Maginot Line, and that very much failed. And the NATO, they were also involved in that, and that will soon fail. Whereas the Hindenburg is a German failure.
Not quite, but you're certainly on the right track with the theme of failure.
Ah, NATO is the only one that hasn't failed yet. Theoretically.
That is correct, Nelly. The Maginot Line, the League of Nations, and the Hindenburg have all recently failed, while NATO has only recently been established. In the face of expanding communist influence in Europe, and particularly after the events of the Berlin blockade, Western powers were forced into what is essentially a new type of collective security. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed in 1949, and in 1950 General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander. And as Nelly has so kindly pointed out, NATO has not yet failed.
I'm certainly not sure if I agree with that attitude. They've done a lot in Europe, and that money is needed to keep a sufficient military presence there.
$13 billion in the US budget in 1950 on military spending, and $60 billion in 1951 on defense. That's an awful lot of money to an organization that looks suspiciously like the League of Nations.
Oh, but there certainly are differences between the two.
Yes, I concur. I agree completely. Whereas the US never actually joined the League of Nations, they are included in NATO, and this gives NATO a lot more power and influence, and this gives them the ability to rebuild infrastructure and influence the economy in Europe.
Exactly. NATO actually has the money to do these things, to practice containment in Europe.
Alright, I must say I do agree with that. NATO definitely has advantages that the League of Nations didn't have. However, while the responses to the European situation came from justifiable intentions, they do have a lot of power now that the US is in, and that they have the mandate that they have. And with great power comes great responsibility. I think there is definitely a lot more potential for them to misuse the power they have.
For sure.
And that's all we have for you this evening. Thank you for watching, and good night. And that's all we have for tonight. Thanks for watching, and good night. That's awkward.
No, let's not do it.
I don't like saying night twice. Alright. No, I'll just do it again.
And that is everything for this evening.
And that's all we have for you this evening. Thank you for watching, and good night.